It began, as many seismic royal scandals do, with something that seemed too absurd to take seriously: a whisper in a corridor, a rumor in a society column, a passing comment at a charity gala. Princess Beatrice had lived her life in the glare of the public spotlight, carefully shaped as the dutiful, reserved daughter of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. From the moment she was born, the palace photographers had captured her in neatly pressed dresses, her red hair catching the light of the cameras like a flame among the gray stone of Windsor. She was the girl who smiled for the cameras even when her parents' own marriage crumbled under tabloid scrutiny. She was the one who had, time and again, sidestepped the sharp edges of royal scandal by keeping her head down and her heart guarded. But even the most carefully crafted lives are built on a foundation of truths, and if one truth shifts, even slightly, the entire structure can come crashing down. That's what Beatrice would soon discover: that her life was not the one she had been told to live, and the people she called her parents were not both who they claimed to be. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It wasn't a story she stumbled upon willingly. For years, whispers had floated through the upper echelons of British society that something about Beatrice's birth was not quite right. Few outside the palace dared to speculate too loudly, and those inside knew better than to leave a trail of proof. The royal family's greatest skill, after all, is not diplomacy, it is silence. Yet silence is fragile. One misplaced letter, one conversation in the wrong ear, one bold request for the truth, and it shatters. The first crack in the facade didn't come from the press. It came from within. In late autumn, Beatrice had undergone a comprehensive genetic health screening as part of a private wellness program recommended by a friend. The motivation was simple enough. Her husband, Edoardo Mapelli Mazzi, had suggested they take a proactive approach to their family's health before trying for another child. The test promised detailed insight into everything from genetic risk factors to ancestry breakdowns. What it didn't promise, what it couldn't possibly prepare her for, was to rewrite her own origin story. She didn't open the results at first. They sat, unread, in an email inbox for over a week, overshadowed by royal events and family obligations. When she finally clicked the link late one night in her Kensington residence, she expected to skim through medical jargon, maybe flag a few points to discuss with her doctor. Instead, her eyes froze on a simple, unembellished line under the paternity and maternity heading. The names were wrong. Or perhaps it was better to say, the names were different. Her mother's name, Sarah Ferguson, was nowhere to be found. Her father's name was as expected, Prince Andrew. But alongside his name, under the maternal match, appeared one that sent an icy wave down her spine. Camilla Rosemary Shand, now known to the world as Queen Camilla. It's the sort of moment you might imagine would make a person scream, faint, or laugh in disbelief. Beatrice did none of those things. She simply stared, her breath slowing, her pulse tightening in her chest. At first, she assumed a mistake. Perhaps the lab had cross-referenced the wrong profile. Perhaps there was a glitch in the system. But the report was unambiguous. The genetic markers, the chromosomal matches, the percentages, they were conclusive. If these results were correct, then the story of her birth was a lie, and the woman she had called Mummy her entire life was not, in fact, her biological mother. She closed her laptop and sat in the dark, the hum of the city outside muffled by heavy curtains. Questions swirled in her head, each more unthinkable than the last. How could this be true? If it was true, who else knew? And if they knew, why had they hidden it from her? In the rare moments when she had thought about her parents' lives before her birth, she had never imagined that Camilla, then the longtime love and eventual wife of Prince Charles, had been entwined in her story. The timelines didn't add up, or perhaps they did. If you were willing to entertain the kind of truth the royal family works hardest to bury. The middle of this story, the part where the seed of doubt grows into a forest of suspicion, began almost immediately. Beatrice reached out to a discreet contact at a private genetics lab in Switzerland, one trusted by wealthy families to handle delicate results. She requested a second, independent test. She didn't want to believe the first one. 2 weeks later, the Swiss lab confirmed it. The results matched the first exactly. Prince Andrew was indeed her biological father. And Camilla, the woman who had once been cast as the villain in the Charles and Diana marriage saga, was her biological mother. This revelation was not just personal. It was dynastic. Royal bloodlines are the lifeblood of monarchy, and the legitimacy of heirs is treated like a matter of national security. Beatrice's very identity, her title, her place in the line of succession, her public role, had been anchored to a lie. And unraveling that lie risked unraveling much more than her own sense of self. She didn't tell anyone at first. Not Eugenie, not Eduardo, not even her father. Instead, she began quietly tracing the years before her birth. The timelines between Andrew's and Camilla's public appearances, their private absences, and the overlapping stretches when they were both curiously unavailable. It was in those quiet weeks of research that she began to see a pattern, one that pointed to a private, passionate affair hidden in the blind spots of the royal diary. There was one night, in particular, that she kept circling back to, a gala in the early 1980s where Camilla was said to have left early due to illness, and Andrew had arrived unusually late, wearing the kind of careless grin that only made sense if you knew what had delayed him. She pieced together these fragments like shards of glass, each one dangerous to hold, each one reflecting a different angle of the truth. By the time winter settled in, Beatrice's life felt like it was split in two. There was the public version, the smiling princess attending charity events, posing for official portraits, engaging in polite small talk with the very people who may have lied to her face for decades. And then there was the private version. The woman who lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every conversation she'd ever had with Andrew, with Camilla, with Sarah. How many times had they almost told her? How many times had they looked her in the eye and chosen silence instead? The end of the introduction is not a resolution. It is a cliff's edge. The DNA results were only the match that lit the fire. What followed would be a blaze that threatened to consume not only Beatrice's relationship with her family, but the very image of the royal family itself. This was no ordinary paternity dispute. This was a revelation with the potential to reach the throne, to fracture the monarchy, and to reshape the legacy of some of its most prominent members. And so we are left with the question, what does a princess do when the truth makes her a stranger in her own family? And what happens when that truth, if revealed, could bring the House of Windsor to its knees? From the moment Princess Beatrice Elizabeth Mary of York entered the world on August 8, 1988, she was wrapped in the pomp and circumstance that comes with being a Windsor. The media splashed her name across front pages. Royal watchers lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the newest addition to the family, and Buckingham Palace released the kind of carefully crafted statement that both celebrated her arrival and guarded the privacy of those involved. It was a ritual the monarchy had perfected over centuries. Control the story, control the perception. For the public, she was simply the eldest daughter of Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York. There was no reason to suspect otherwise. As a child, Beatrice seemed to embody the warmth and charm the royals occasionally allowed the public to see. She had her father's distinctive features, her mother's vivacious spirit, and an undeniable aura of privilege. She grew up in palaces and estates, traveled in chauffeured cars, and attended schools that were as exclusive as they were expensive. Photographers adored her. She was expressive, photogenic, and seemed genuinely delighted by the people around her. Public appearances with her parents were polished yet relatable, a young princess holding her mother's hand, waving shyly at crowds, or leaning into her father's embrace. What the public didn't see was the strain that began early in her life. Her parents' marriage, while initially a fairy tale match in the eyes of the press, was already fracturing by the time Beatrice could walk. The constant presence of paparazzi, combined with Andrew's naval career that kept him away for long stretches and Sarah's struggles to adapt to the constraints of royal life, created a home life that was anything but serene. When the couple separated in 1992, Beatrice was only 4 years old. For most children, divorce is a private family matter. For Beatrice, it was international news, dissected by tabloids and late-night television hosts alike. Despite the turmoil, both Andrew and Sarah were determined to shield Beatrice and her younger sister, Eugenie, from the worst of the fallout. They maintained a joint approach to parenting that was, by royal standards, unusually hands-on. Publicly, the sisters appeared to be thriving. They attended prestigious schools, took part in carefully staged family holidays, and remained a visible part of royal events. During her teenage years, Beatrice became known for her academic diligence and her interest in charitable work. She was not a rebellious royal. There were no tabloid exposés of wild nights out, no whispered scandals. Instead, she cultivated an image of responsibility and sincerity. Her causes were diverse, from children's welfare to dyslexia awareness, a cause close to her heart as she herself had struggled with the learning difficulty from a young age. These commitments made her relatable to the public and respectable in the eyes of the monarchy. Yet, as her profile grew, so did the subtle weight of expectation. In the royal family, being well-behaved is not enough. One must also embody the narrative the palace wishes to project. For Beatrice, that meant being the loyal daughter of the Duke of York, a steadfast link in the chain of succession, and a dutiful representative of the monarchy's next generation. This narrative left no room for ambiguity about her parentage. To the public and, it seemed, to Beatrice herself, her lineage was unquestionable. Her relationship with Prince Andrew was particularly scrutinized. The Duke of York was often portrayed as a devoted father, one of the few senior royals who seemed to find genuine joy in fatherhood. He attended school events, accompanied Beatrice on skiing trips, and was a visible presence in her life. The affection between them appeared mutual and unforced. But in hindsight, and especially through the lens of the DNA results that would come decades later, certain moments from their past now take on a more complex meaning. There were instances when Andrew's protectiveness verged on possessiveness, when his guidance felt unusually intense. At the time, these were interpreted as the instincts of a doting father. Later, they would be reconsidered as the behaviors of a man guarding a deeper secret. Sarah Ferguson, on the other hand, cultivated a public image as a lively, sometimes scandal-prone, but ultimately loving mother. Her bond with Beatrice was often celebrated in interviews and photographs. But in private, there were reports, rarely publicized, of tensions between mother and daughter, particularly during Beatrice's adolescent years. Sarah's own turbulent relationship with the royal family sometimes spilled into her parenting, leaving Beatrice caught between loyalty to her mother and the unspoken obligations of her royal status. Through it all, Camilla, now known to the world as Queen Camilla but then the longtime partner of Prince Charles, occupied a peculiar position in Beatrice's world. Publicly, their interactions were polite but distant. They moved in the same royal circles, attended the same events, and occasionally exchanged words at family gatherings. There was nothing overt to suggest an unusually close bond, but neither was there any visible animosity. To the outside observer, theirs was a neutral relationship, one of those peripheral family connections that exist without much depth. But as time would prove, the truth was far from neutral. By her 20s, Beatrice had carved out a space for herself that was both within and outside the monarchy. She undertook royal engagements, but also pursued a private career in finance and consulting, a balance that allowed her to remain connected to the crown without being entirely dependent on it. She traveled extensively, often for work, and cultivated friendships both inside and outside the aristocracy. Her romantic life, too, was subject to speculation, though she managed to keep most of it out of the tabloids until her engagement to Edoardo Mapelli-Mazzi. The wedding, held in July 2020 during a period of strict pandemic protocols, was a scaled-down affair that nonetheless carried the grandeur of royal tradition. Beatrice wore a vintage dress borrowed from the Queen and a tiara from the royal collection, symbolic gestures meant to reinforce her place within the family and the continuity of the monarchy. On that day, there was no hint of the personal earthquake that lay in her future. Yet, in retrospect, there were always undercurrents, subtle, almost imperceptible signals that not everything was as it seemed. Family photographs in which Camilla's gaze lingered on Beatrice just a fraction longer than expected. Anecdotes from palace staff about private conversations between Andrew and Camilla during periods when their public lives supposedly kept them apart. A vague but persistent sense that certain topics were off-limits in Beatrice's presence, even within the family. These were fragments that, at the time, were too inconsequential to mean anything. They were the kinds of details that only take on significance when the truth comes to light. And in Beatrice's case, that truth was not just about her personal identity, but about the complex, often contradictory relationships that define the British royal family. For the world, Princess Beatrice remained an emblem of stability, a young woman navigating her royal role with grace and dignity, untainted by the scandals that seemed to follow so many of her relatives. But behind the carefully managed public image was a life built on an unspoken arrangement, one in which silence served as both shield and prison. That silence would hold for more than 3 decades, until a moment of curiosity and self-care, a simple decision to take a genetic test, would shatter it forever. Her journey from beloved royal daughter to a woman confronting the shattering reality of her own parentage would not just alter her personal path. It would force the monarchy itself to reckon with questions it had long avoided, questions about truth, loyalty, and the cost of protecting an institution at the expense of the individuals within it. The British royal family is built on ceremony, tradition, and a mastery of controlled narratives. But beneath the layers of pageantry and public performance, it is also a web of secrets, half-truths, and unspoken understandings. In the gilded rooms of Buckingham Palace and the shadowed corridors of Clarence House, whispers have always been a form of currency. They pass quietly from one trusted aide to another, from a lady-in-waiting to a family confidant, often so subtly that they leave no trace. It was in these hushed exchanges that the first faint threads of Beatrice's true story began to weave themselves into palace lore. The earliest rumors were not the kind that screamed scandal. They were small, almost invisible, hidden in the private remarks of staff who noticed things others overlooked. A nursery maid once commented on how the baby seemed to have features she couldn't quite place in either of her supposed parents. A security officer stationed at a Windsor estate remarked to a colleague that Camilla, who at the time had no official role in Beatrice's life, appeared unusually invested in her well-being during certain family gatherings. These comments were not accusations, not even suspicions, just observations filed away and eventually forgotten by most. But in the palace, nothing is ever entirely forgotten. Information, no matter how inconsequential, has a way of lingering in the minds of those who work in close proximity to power. In the years that followed, these scraps of memory would resurface in conversations whenever Beatrice's name came up in private circles. Some whispered that her resemblance to certain members of Camilla's family was uncanny, more than could be explained by the distant connections that tie most of Britain's aristocracy together. By the mid-1990s, as the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage dominated the headlines, the relationship between Andrew and Camilla became a quieter, background note in the palace's internal chatter. It wasn't that people thought they were romantically involved at that moment. Camilla's heart and attention were publicly tied to Charles, but there was a persistent knowledge among certain insiders that the two had once been closer than outsiders realized. There were shared dinners in the early 1980s, unexplained overlaps in travel schedules, and late-night phone calls that were described, when asked about, as discussions of mutual friends. Even within the family, there were occasional moments that hinted at a deeper connection. Camilla seemed to take an unusual interest in Beatrice's milestones, her christening, her first day at school, certain birthdays, events that should have been peripheral to her at the time. Those who noticed chalked it up to the close-knit nature of the royal circle, where everyone attends everyone else's important occasions. Yet the way Camilla's eyes lingered on the little girl, the way she spoke to her with a softness that suggested familiarity, remained in the memories of those who paid attention. Whispers have their own strange life in the palace. They are rarely spoken directly to the people they concern. Instead, they travel through indirect routes, disguised as casual remarks or jokes. In Beatrice's case, there were moments in her teenage years when she caught faint hints of something she couldn't quite understand, an offhand comment from a distant relative, a raised eyebrow between 2 senior staff members when her name came up in a conversation about royal succession. She dismissed them at the time. After all, what reason would she have to question the most fundamental truth of her life? But for the staff who had been in service long enough to remember the 1980s, there was a story they didn't tell aloud but understood implicitly, that the lines between public relationships and private affairs in the royal family were often blurred, and that paternity, while always presented as fact to the public, was sometimes a matter of quiet negotiation behind closed doors. This wasn't unique to Beatrice. The history of Europe's royal houses is littered with similar secrets, some never uncovered, others only revealed decades later when the consequences no longer mattered. The turning point for these whispers came during a royal family gathering in the early 2000s. It was a private dinner, never intended for the public eye, attended by a mixture of senior royals, extended family, and long-serving staff. Over the course of the evening, after the wine had flowed and conversations became less guarded, an offhand remark was made by a courtier, one who had served both Andrew and Charles in different capacities. The comment was brief, just a suggestion that some things are best left unspoken for Beatrice's sake. It drew no immediate reaction, but it left a silence in its wake, one of those pauses that feels heavy with unvoiced agreement. In the days that followed, nothing more was said. But for the few who caught that moment, it was a confirmation of what they had quietly suspected, that there was a piece of Beatrice's story that did not fit the official narrative. The palace operates like a fortress when it comes to scandal. For every public crisis that makes the front page, there are half a dozen that are quietly extinguished before they can spark. In Beatrice's case, the whispers never escalated into a full blaze, not because there was no truth to them, but because the stakes were too high. Revealing that Camilla could be her biological mother would have been catastrophic, not only for Beatrice's identity, but for the carefully managed image of the royal family. It would have cast a shadow over Andrew's role, complicated Charles's position as heir to the throne, and undermined the narrative that Camilla herself had been working to rehabilitate in the eyes of the public. As the years passed, the whispers grew quieter but never completely disappeared. They would surface whenever an old photograph emerged, whenever someone noticed the subtleties in Beatrice's features, whenever an insider remembered just how intertwined Andrew and Camilla's paths had been before official histories began to record them. By the time Beatrice reached her 30s, she was aware, at least on some instinctive level, that certain truths were being kept from her. She could feel it in the way certain questions about her early life were deflected, in the odd looks exchanged between family members when she asked about events from before she was born. But without proof, it was just a vague unease, the kind that could be dismissed as paranoia or imagination. What she didn't know was that proof had always existed, carefully locked away, known only to a select few whose loyalty to the monarchy outweighed their loyalty to any individual. What she didn't know was that this proof would one day come to her not through palace archives or family confessions, but in the sterile, clinical language of a DNA report, one that would confirm every whisper she had ignored, every uneasy feeling she had brushed aside. And so, the whispers continued, passing quietly from one generation of staff to the next, from one careful conversation to another, waiting for the day when the truth would no longer be hidden. That day, as fate would have it, was closer than anyone in the palace was prepared for. Sometimes, the most life-altering revelations begin not with an act of confrontation, but with something that seems almost mundane. For Princess Beatrice, the first step toward uncovering the truth about her parentage did not come from a leak to the press or a palace scandal. It began quietly, innocuously, with a health recommendation from a friend over coffee. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in London, the kind where the air felt sharp enough to wake you from the inside out. Beatrice had arranged to meet an old-school friend in a discreet cafe tucked into a side street far from the tourist-heavy areas. The conversation had drifted from work to family, from mutual acquaintances to health. The friend, who had recently undergone a comprehensive genetic test for health screening, spoke passionately about the importance of knowing one's genetic risks. "It's not just about ancestry," she explained. "It's about understanding what you might pass on to your children, what you can prevent, what you can be ready for." At first, Beatrice brushed it off. She had never been overly preoccupied with medical concerns beyond the occasional checkup. But the friend's words lingered in her mind. As a mother to her young stepson, and with hopes of having children of her own with Eduardo, the idea of gaining deeper insight into her health began to seem both responsible and necessary. It was an idea that resonated more strongly as the days passed. Her decision to proceed with the test came not with fanfare, but with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to discretion. She chose a highly reputable private clinic in Switzerland, the kind frequented by high-net-worth individuals and political figures, precisely because of their ironclad confidentiality. Her request was simple: A full genetic screening, including hereditary risk factors and detailed ancestry mapping. She scheduled it during a trip that already had her in Geneva for a charity meeting, ensuring that even her staff would have no reason to suspect anything unusual. The test itself was quick and unremarkable. A saliva sample, a few forms, and assurances that results would arrive in 2 to 3 weeks. She thought little of it as she left the clinic. There was no sense, in that moment, that she had set something in motion that could not be undone. For the first week after the test, the thought barely crossed her mind. Her calendar was filled with engagements, a visit to a children's hospital, meetings with charitable organizations, private dinners with friends. But as the expected date for the results drew near, she felt a subtle tension in her chest. It was the kind of nervous anticipation one might feel before opening exam results, except she had no reason to believe anything was at stake beyond her medical history. The results email arrived on a Thursday evening. She was in her Kensington residence, the autumn light fading outside, the faint hum of traffic filtering through double-glazed windows. She saw the subject line in her inbox, "Your genetic health and ancestry report is ready," and hesitated. She thought about forwarding it to her doctor, letting him review it first, but something compelled her to open it herself. The report was clinical in its precision, laid out in clear sections. The first pages covered her health risks, many of which were unremarkable. She scrolled through charts and percentages, relieved to find nothing alarming. But when she reached the section labeled Parental and Ancestral Confirmation, her eyes caught on something that made her sit upright. Under Confirmed Biological Father, the name matched what she had always known, Prince Andrew, Duke of York. But under Confirmed Biological Mother, the name was not Sarah Margaret Ferguson. It was Camilla Rosemary Shand. The digital text seemed to glare at her from the screen, impossibly bold against the sterile white background. For a moment, she was certain she was reading it wrong, that her brain had stumbled over the words. She closed the laptop, took a deep breath, and opened it again. The name was still there. Shock gave way to confusion. She checked the sample code, ensuring it matched hers. It did. She reread the accompanying explanation. Genetic material from both parents had been compared to available data in the clinic's secure database, cross-referenced with international genetic archives. The match was conclusive. Beatrice's first reaction was to doubt the integrity of the test. Labs make mistakes. Data gets corrupted. Perhaps another client's results had somehow been merged with hers. But the more she read, the more she realized the depth of the verification process. This was no over-the-counter ancestry kit. It was a medically certified analysis, designed for absolute accuracy. That night, she barely slept. She replayed memories from childhood, combing through them for anything that might explain or contradict what she had just learned. There was no obvious answer. Sarah had been present at every major milestone of her life. There had been no dramatic absences, no sudden shifts that could have suggested an absence during pregnancy. And yet, the DNA results were indisputable. By morning, disbelief had hardened into determination. She needed certainty beyond a single report. She contacted a trusted intermediary, a family friend with deep connections in the discreet medical world, and arranged for a second test, this time through an independent genetics facility in Zurich. She traveled under the guise of attending a private art exhibition, carrying with her the same quiet urgency that now colored every thought. The Zurich lab promised results within 10 days. Those 10 days stretched like months. Beatrice went through her public schedule on autopilot, smiling for cameras, attending meetings, engaging in polite conversation, all while an undercurrent of dread tugged at her. Each night, she lay awake, wondering why her mind kept returning to certain moments. A lingering look from Camilla across a crowded room, an offhand comment from Andrew about the complications of parenthood, the way certain questions about her early years were always deflected. When the results finally arrived, she opened them with trembling hands. The findings were identical to the Geneva report. Prince Andrew confirmed as her biological father, Camilla Rosemary Shand as her biological mother. The probability was listed as greater than 99.99%. There was no ambiguity, no room for error. It was then that the reality began to settle in. If these results were accurate, and every piece of evidence suggested they were, then her entire understanding of her identity had been built on a falsehood. And more than that, the people she loved most had been complicit in keeping this from her. The spark had been lit, and though she did not yet know it, the fire it would ignite would burn through more than just her personal relationships. It would threaten to consume the careful facade of the royal family, exposing cracks that no amount of tradition or ceremony could conceal. There are moments in life when the world does not explode outward in chaos, but rather implodes quietly, folding in on itself until the familiar shapes and colors of reality are unrecognizable. For Princess Beatrice, that moment was not the first time she saw Camilla's name on a DNA report. It was the second. The Zurich results left no cracks for doubt to seep through, no comfortable space where she could file the revelation away as a bizarre clerical error. It was conclusive. The two most important figures in her origin story were not who she had believed them to be for 35 years. The morning the Zurich email arrived, she was sitting alone at the breakfast table in her private Kensington residence. Outside, London was waking to another cool, gray day. She had been going through her diary, thinking ahead to upcoming engagements, when her phone buzzed with the discreet notification she had been waiting for. She hesitated before opening it. Her fingers hovered over the screen for what felt like an eternity, the air in the room growing heavier by the second. She knew, even before reading the words, that the result would mirror the first. But hope is a strange, persistent thing. It makes you believe, against all logic, that you might still find relief on the other side of disappointment. She tapped the message, scrolled past the procedural disclaimers, and saw the familiar, sterile confirmation: biological father, Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Biological mother, Camilla Rosemary Shand. Probability of match, greater than 99.99%. There it was, in black and white. Final. Irreversible. The first emotion was not rage, nor even sadness. It was a sense of dislocation so intense it made her feel physically unsteady. Her mind scrambled to reconcile decades of memories with this new truth, but nothing aligned neatly. Childhood moments now seemed reframed in an alien light. Her father's protectiveness, Camilla's curious warmth during certain family events, Sarah's occasional, inexplicable distance. They all stood before her like pieces of a puzzle she had never thought to assemble. She pushed her plate aside, untouched, and stared out the window. The palace gardens in her memory seemed idyllic, green lawns rolling out like the very definition of stability. But she understood now that stability had been an illusion. She was not the daughter of the woman who had raised her, not entirely the person the public believed her to be. The monarchy, so obsessed with lineage and bloodlines, had shielded her from this truth because it was more than personal. It was political dynamite. Her thoughts shifted quickly from shock to questions. Endless, unrelenting questions. When had Andrew and Camilla's affair happened? Had Charles known? Had Sarah known? And if they had all known, how could they have looked her in the eye all these years without ever telling her? That morning, she tried to call her sister, Eugenie. Her voice trembled on the first words, but she couldn't bring herself to explain. Instead, she asked about her nephew, made small talk about weekend plans, then hung up quickly. How could she tell Eugenie something that would forever change how she saw their family? Her next instinct was to reach out to her father, or at least, the man she had always called her father. But every time she pictured the conversation, her stomach twisted. She could almost hear his voice, calm and measured, telling her that some truths were better left alone. She could almost see his face, somewhere between contrition and stubbornness, insisting that his role in her life mattered more than the circumstances of her birth. Instead, she sat down at her desk and began to write. The words poured out in a stream of consciousness letter she never intended to send. She wrote to Andrew, to Camilla, to Sarah, to herself. She wrote about feeling like a stranger in her own life, about the betrayal that came not from the affair itself, but from the deliberate decision to keep the truth buried. She wrote about the impossible position she was now in. Too loyal to publicly expose the secret, too wounded to pretend nothing had changed. As the days passed, she became hyper-aware of every interaction. When she saw Andrew at a family lunch, she noticed the way he watched her across the table, as though trying to read her mind. When Camilla arrived at a charity gala, Beatrice caught her eye for the briefest moment, and saw something there that looked like recognition or perhaps resignation. And when Sarah called to check in, Her voice carried a strain that Beatrice could no longer ignore. But what struck her most was the silence. No one had confronted her. No one had asked if something was wrong. It was as if the royal family's instinct for survival had collectively decided that if no one acknowledged the truth, it could somehow remain contained. Behind the scenes, however, her discovery had already sent ripples through the palace. Discreet inquiries had been made. Who had arranged the tests? Who might have access to the results? Whether there was any risk of the story leaking to the press. The fear was not just for the personal embarrassment of those involved, but for the potential constitutional implications. If Beatrice's mother was Camilla, it meant the queen consort had been entangled in a scandal that reached back decades, one that could have altered the public's perception of her long before she married Charles. Beatrice could sense this undercurrent of unease even without being told outright. It was in the way certain aides avoided her, in the subtle changes to her schedule, in the coded language used when discussing family matters. One evening, unable to bear the tension any longer, she took a late walk through St. James's Park. The air was damp and cool, the lamps casting long shadows on the pathways. She thought about the duty she had been raised with. To serve the crown, to protect the family, to maintain the dignity of the monarchy. But she also thought about herself, about the right any person has to their own story, to the truth of their own existence. The results had changed everything not only because they rewrote her past, but because they forced her to choose between two identities, the princess molded by the monarchy, and the woman who now knew the monarchy had deceived her. She returned home that night knowing that there would be no going back to the way things were. The truth was no longer a secret she could unknow. It was a living, breathing presence in her life, demanding to be addressed. And somewhere deep inside, she understood that the decision she would make next, whether to confront those involved, to walk away quietly, or to bring the truth into the light, would not just define her future, but could shake the foundations of the royal family itself. The British monarchy has weathered countless storms, but some of its most dangerous have been those never seen by the public, the ones kept locked behind palace doors, protected by silence, loyalty, and the calculated erasure of truth. The relationship between Prince Andrew and Camilla Rosemary Shand began as one of those hidden tempests, quietly brewing in the shadows long before Princess Beatrice was born. To understand how such an affair could happen and remain concealed, one must understand the complex, often overlapping social circles of the royal family in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The public narrative has always centered on Charles and Camilla's long-standing bond, the one that weathered the turbulence of Charles's marriage to Princess Diana. What has rarely been acknowledged is that, during certain stretches of time, Camilla moved through the royal court with a degree of fluidity that gave her access not only to Charles, but to others within his family. Prince Andrew, younger than Charles by over a decade, was in his 20s during the early 1980s, charismatic, athletic, and known for his easy charm. While Charles was burdened with the weight of his role as heir, Andrew was freer, less encumbered by the expectations of a future king. Camilla, already navigating the complexities of her own marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles and her enduring tie to Charles, found herself in the same elite gatherings, hunts, and private dinners where the Duke of York also appeared. The spark, according to those who worked in close proximity at the time, was not immediate. Their first encounters were polite, cordial, two members of a tightly knit aristocratic world where everyone knew everyone else. But there was an undercurrent, a shared understanding of what it meant to be in the royal sphere without always fitting perfectly into it. Both had reputations for being more relaxed, less formal than the stiff royal archetype. Both understood the necessity of keeping certain truths away from prying eyes. The affair, it is believed, began in the early months of 1987. A period when Charles was heavily engaged in public duties and Diana was gaining unprecedented public attention. Camilla's relationship with Charles was strained, though not severed, by the constant media scrutiny. Andrew, meanwhile, had just returned from an extended naval deployment. They found themselves in the same social setting more than once that spring, including a private country house weekend hosted by a mutual friend whose estate was a frequent escape for senior royals. It was there, according to palace staff who later pieced the timeline together, that the nature of their relationship shifted. A late-night conversation by the fireplace lingered longer than it should have. They began exchanging notes, hand-delivered by trusted aides, under the pretext of coordinating social events. Soon, the correspondence turned more personal, and the meetings more deliberate. The royal family has its own unspoken rules for these situations. Affairs are not unheard of in the aristocracy, but discretion is everything. Those who knew of the connection between Andrew and Camilla kept their silence, partly out of loyalty, partly because implicating either of them could have had explosive consequences. At the time, Andrew was still unmarried, but Camilla's proximity to Charles made any potential scandal dangerous on multiple fronts. The trysts were carefully orchestrated. Meetings would happen during hunting weekends, in private apartments within sprawling estates, or in the quiet hours after official dinners. Camilla's skill at navigating secrecy was matched by Andrew's access to secure, unmonitored spaces. It was during one of these stretches, the autumn of 1987, when Sarah Ferguson was often occupied with public appearances and Parker Bowles was traveling, that the affair is believed to have reached its most intense stage. What drew them together is still a matter of speculation among those few who knew. Some believe Camilla found in Andrew a lightness absent from her relationship with Charles, a respite from the emotional intensity of their bond. Others suggest Andrew was drawn to Camilla's confidence and her understanding of the royal world, something many of his romantic interests at the time lacked. Whatever the reason, their connection endured long enough to alter the course of several lives. By early 1988, Camilla was quietly navigating a pregnancy. In public, her life appeared unchanged. She maintained her role in Charles's orbit, attended society functions with her husband, and carried herself with the same composure she always had. Andrew, too, showed no outward signs of a private upheaval. The few staff members who noticed anything, discreet visits, unexplained absences, were either sworn to secrecy or dismissed from their posts under polite pretexts. If there was ever a plan for how to handle the child's identity, it was executed with precision. Publicly, Sarah Ferguson was announced as expecting her first child in early 1988, and the timing aligned perfectly for Beatrice's eventual August birth. The official narrative was seamless. Andrew and Sarah's daughter, born in London, welcomed into the family with all the pomp and ceremony befitting a royal child. In the months and years that followed, the connection between Andrew and Camilla seemed to cool, at least outwardly. They maintained a cordial relationship at family events, never drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Charles's eventual marriage troubles and Camilla's reemergence in his life overshadowed any past involvement she may have had with his brother. The secret was folded into the fabric of royal life, a thread invisible to the public eye, but always present for those who knew where to look. There were, however, subtle tells that escaped notice at the time, but became glaring in retrospect. Camilla's presence at certain milestones in Beatrice's life. Moments when her attendance seemed neither obligatory nor entirely expected, stood out to the few who tracked such details. Andrew's particular protectiveness over Beatrice, sometimes at odds with Sarah's own instincts, also hinted at a deeper investment. The affair had ended, but its consequences had not. For over 3 decades, the truth lay buried under layers of protocol, loyalty, and the unspoken agreement that certain things simply could not be acknowledged. And yet, as is often the case in the royal family, secrets have a way of eroding over time. All it takes is one crack in the wall, in this case, a DNA test, for the whole structure to begin to give way. When Beatrice would later piece together the story, she would find that the timelines aligned too perfectly to dismiss. The photographs, the family gatherings, the unexplained overlaps, they were no longer harmless coincidences. They were evidence of a relationship that had been carefully hidden, not just from the public, but from her. The secret affair between Prince Andrew and Camilla was not simply a matter of personal betrayal. It was a political and dynastic fault line, one that had been successfully concealed for decades. But now, with scientific proof in her hands, Beatrice held the key to a truth that could fracture the monarchy's carefully maintained image, and she was left to decide whether to turn it in the lock. The royal family has always understood that control is survival. Control of image, control of narrative, control of the smallest details of public life. When scandal strikes, The first instinct is not to address it head-on, but to manage it quietly, surgically, behind the thick walls of tradition and protocol. When Princess Beatrice learned the truth about her paternity, the family's reaction followed this exact script. Except this time, the scandal wasn't just a threat to the crown. It was a direct wound to one of their own. The first ripple came the day Beatrice decided she couldn't carry the knowledge alone any longer. It had been weeks since she'd received the Zurich results. Weeks of sleepless nights, forced smiles, and rehearsed small talk. She arranged a private meeting with her father, the man she had always believed was her anchor in the often stormy waters of royal life. They met in Andrew's private suite at Royal Lodge in Windsor, away from the main corridors and eyes of casual visitors. The room was heavy with the scent of leather and old wood, the kind of place where conversations about family legacy and military service seemed more natural than those about betrayal. Beatrice sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly, knuckles white. "I know," she said simply. There was no preamble, no carefully constructed bridge into the subject. She watched his face for the smallest twitch, and she saw it. The fraction of a second flicker before he masked it with a calm, almost resigned expression. "What do you think you know?" he asked, his voice low-measured. "I know that Camilla is my mother," she replied. The words felt foreign in her mouth, as though speaking them would make them truer than the paper that bore the DNA results. For a moment, silence hung between them, the kind that presses down on the chest and slows the air. Then Andrew leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Some things," he said, "are more complicated than they appear, and some things are best left in the past." It was not a denial. It was not a confession. It was, in the language of the monarchy, a tacit acknowledgement that she had stumbled upon something real and something dangerous. In the days that followed, word traveled quietly through the inner circle. Beatrice had confronted Andrew. Beatrice knew. Meetings were held in rooms that had been the site of countless crisis talks before. Not just to address her discovery, but to assess the potential damage if the truth were ever to escape the palace gates. Queen Camilla's response was equally telling. When Beatrice requested a meeting, Camilla suggested a private tea at Clarence House, under the guise of a cordial family catch-up. Beatrice arrived to find Camilla seated in a high-backed chair, posture impeccable, expression soft but unreadable. "I'm not here for pleasantries," Beatrice began. "I've had 2 independent DNA tests. Both say you're my mother." Camilla didn't flinch. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and said, "I never wanted you to find out like this." It was as close to an admission as Beatrice would get. The conversation that followed was more about control than reconciliation. Camilla spoke of protecting Beatrice from public judgment, of shielding her from the burden of scandal. She reminded her that the monarchy had endured centuries because its members knew when to keep certain truths locked away. The message was clear. Silence was not only expected, it was demanded. But Beatrice was no longer sure she could comply. Behind closed doors, senior courtiers were drawing up strategies. They considered the possibility of discrediting the DNA results, of framing them as the product of tampering or fraud. They discussed increasing Beatrice's official engagements, reinforcing her image as a devoted royal, making the public connection between her and Sarah Ferguson even stronger in the press. They also prepared contingency plans. If the story leaked, the family would present it as an absurd conspiracy theory, the work of malicious outsiders with an agenda against the monarchy. A trusted journalist, known for their loyalty to the palace, was quietly briefed to run a flattering profile on Beatrice that painted her life as unshakably rooted in her parents' love. But the more the palace tried to control the situation, the more it became clear to Beatrice that the real concern was not her well-being, but the preservation of the institution's image. In every conversation, the focus returned to the monarchy's stability, the public's perception, the historical record. Her personal grief, confusion, and sense of betrayal seemed to be secondary. She found herself walking the halls of Buckingham Palace with a heightened awareness, noticing how quickly conversations stopped when she entered a room, how staff members avoided lingering in her presence. She was no longer simply a princess. She was a risk factor. Even her sister Eugenie noticed the change. "Something's different," she said one evening during a private dinner. Beatrice hesitated, weighing the comfort of sharing the truth against the burden of placing it on Eugenie's shoulders. In the end, She chose silence, not out of loyalty to the palace, but because she didn't want her sister to carry the same weight. The tipping point came during a small family gathering at Sandringham. Charles, now king, addressed Beatrice privately in his study. His tone was calm, almost paternal, but his words carried the weight of command. "You are part of something larger than yourself," he told her. "Sometimes that means carrying things you would rather set down. We all have our crosses to bear." It was a veiled order, one that reinforced the palace's position. The truth would remain buried, for the sake of the monarchy. But Beatrice was beginning to realize that the truth, once known, doesn't stay buried. It changes the way you see every face, every tradition, every speech about duty and honor. It turns loyalty into a question instead of a given. The palace had reacted swiftly, decisively, with all the mechanisms it had honed over centuries. But in doing so, it had also confirmed to Beatrice that her discovery was not just a personal betrayal. It was a structural one. They weren't simply asking her to keep a family secret. They were asking her to protect a lie that underpinned part of the monarchy's public image. And as she left Sandringham that evening, the cold winter air biting at her cheeks, she knew she could no longer pretend this was just about her. It was about the integrity of an institution that had demanded her silence from the moment she could speak. It began, as these things often do, with a whisper in the wrong ear. The royal family had managed for decades to keep certain scandals contained within the walls of their estates, locked away behind smiles, traditions, and carefully choreographed appearances. But in an age where information travels faster than damage control, even the tightest lids have a way of slipping. The first public hint appeared in an obscure online blog devoted to royal gossip. It wasn't a headline that screamed scandal, but a cryptic post from an anonymous writer who claimed to have received credible information about a royal with unexpected parentage. The post was vague, lacking names or specifics, but it was enough to stir the curiosity of niche royal watchers who had a knack for connecting dots others didn't see. Within days, social media accounts dedicated to royal analysis began to speculate. One post read, "Look at the old photos of Princess Beatrice and Queen Camilla side by side. The resemblance is uncanny. More than to Sarah Ferguson. Just saying." It was the kind of throwaway comment that might have died in the noise of the internet, if not for the timing. Camilla had recently been in the public eye for a series of high-profile engagements, and her face was everywhere. People began to notice details they had never paid attention to before: the shape of the nose, the curve of the smile, the particular shade of hair in certain lights. The palace, well aware of how quickly idle speculation can spiral, convened an urgent meeting with their communications team. Their strategy was simple: ignore the noise. Directly addressing the rumors would only validate them. Instead, they flooded Beatrice's public schedule with appearances alongside Sarah Ferguson, reinforcing the image of the close mother-daughter bond. They arranged for new photographs of the two together at charity events, smiling and laughing, their arms linked. But in the digital age, denial by omission is a dangerous game. The more the palace tried to reinforce the official narrative, the more online sleuths doubled down on their theories. They began dissecting timelines, pulling archival photographs from the late 1980s, comparing the dates of Camilla's public appearances with periods when she was conspicuously absent. They found gaps. They noticed patterns. And with each observation, the theory gained momentum. The first mainstream outlet to touch the story was not a British tabloid. Those were still too cautious, too tied to palace access to risk the wrath of the crown without solid evidence. Instead, it was a Canadian entertainment magazine that ran a speculative piece framed as a what-if scenario. The headline read, "Could a royal DNA bombshell be brewing behind palace walls?" Inside, the article danced around the subject, never naming Beatrice directly, but including just enough context for readers to put the pieces together. That was the point of no return. Once a foreign outlet had cracked the surface, British tabloids began circling like sharks, each one trying to find the proof that would allow them to run the story without fear of legal repercussions. They called former palace staff, ex-security officers, anyone who might have been close enough to notice something unusual. Some hung up immediately. Others entertained the calls just long enough to drive up their asking price for exclusive interviews. Beatrice, meanwhile, felt the shift in the air. Friends began texting her links to online threads. Paparazzi, who had once been content to snap a few shots at official events, now lingered outside her private residence. A photographer followed her to a lunch meeting in Chelsea, and when the photos appeared online, the captions were littered with speculative comments about her resemblance to Camilla. The pressure reached a breaking point when a journalist from a reputable broadsheet contacted her directly, requesting an off-the-record conversation. The reporter claimed to have information from two separate sources confirming the results of her DNA test. Beatrice didn't reply, but the call alone was enough to confirm her fears. The secret was no longer just hers, and it was no longer entirely contained within the palace. Behind the scenes, the family's crisis management unit was split on how to proceed. Some argued for a preemptive strike, issue a firm denial, threaten legal action against anyone who printed the story, and lean heavily on sympathetic media outlets to discredit the rumors. Others warned that if hard evidence emerged, leaked lab results, a credible insider speaking on record, any denial would backfire catastrophically. Camilla's approach was to remain unshaken in public. She carried out her engagements with the same poise as ever, smiling for cameras, offering gracious words to those she met. In private, however, she was deeply aware of the danger. The media had forgiven many things over the years, but a hidden child with another senior royal, especially one now fully grown and in the public eye, would be a scandal of historic proportions. Andrew, by contrast, was less measured. Those close to the situation said he made several angry phone calls to editors, warning them that publishing such lies would result in swift legal consequences. His aggressive stance only served to pique interest further. Journalists began digging harder, sensing there was more to the story than the palace wanted anyone to know. The tipping point came when a well-known tabloid published a blurred image of what they claimed was a confidential document related to Beatrice's DNA test. The document itself was too pixelated to read, but the accompanying article left little doubt about the implications. If authentic, it read, this could rewrite the official history of the royal family. The palace issued a strongly worded statement dismissing the report as fabricated nonsense, but by then, the damage was done. The public was engaged, the speculation had gone mainstream, and the story was now impossible to contain. Public reaction was divided. Some expressed sympathy for Beatrice, arguing that no one should be defined or judged by the circumstances of their birth. Others were more cynical, claiming this was yet another example of royal hypocrisy, a family that preached tradition while hiding its own indiscretions. Social media hashtags began trending, some in support of Beatrice, others demanding full transparency from the monarchy. For Beatrice, each headline was a tightening vice. She avoided public events for several days, knowing that every camera flash would be accompanied by shouted questions she couldn't answer. She watched as her life, once defined by the quiet privilege of being a non-working royal, was now being picked apart by strangers who debated her very identity as if it were a game. Inside the palace, the storm was no longer just about keeping the truth hidden. It was about managing a rapidly shifting public narrative, one that threatened to erode the fragile goodwill the monarchy had been building in recent years. The family's options were narrowing. They could continue to deny, hoping the story would eventually burn out, or they could prepare for the possibility that, very soon, the truth would no longer be theirs to control. In the days following the eruption of rumors and media speculation, the royal family faced the challenge of managing an unprecedented crisis. A scandal that struck at the heart of its carefully maintained narrative of lineage, loyalty, and tradition. Among those most scrutinized were Queen Camilla and Prince Andrew, two figures whose responses would either quell the storm or fan its flames. Camilla's public silence was deliberate and telling. In interviews and official appearances, she maintained a composed and gracious demeanor, choosing carefully measured words that neither confirmed nor denied the allegations swirling around her. When questioned by reporters, her responses were polite but opaque, often redirecting attention to her charitable work or the importance of family unity. "I am focused on my duties and supporting the king," she said at one event, avoiding any direct mention of the rumors. Behind the scenes, however, Camilla was anything but passive. Those close to her described a woman grappling with the weight of long-buried secrets now threatening to surface with devastating impact. She convened meetings with senior advisors and legal counsel, exploring every possible avenue to contain the fallout. Damage control plans range from aggressive legal actions against media outlets to strategic leaks aimed at controlling the narrative. Despite her efforts, there was an undercurrent of frustration in Camilla's camp. The emergence of DNA evidence, undeniable and scientific, limited the scope of traditional palace denials. Unlike vague insinuations or hearsay, genetic proof could not be easily dismissed as gossip or fabrication. The weight of truth pressed on every carefully constructed facade. Prince Andrew's reaction was markedly different, marked by a mixture of denial, anger, and defiance. Publicly, he issued statements condemning the rumors as categorically false and a deliberate attempt to malign my character and that of my family. His legal team reportedly sent cease and desist letters to several media organizations, warning of defamation lawsuits should they persist in publishing the story. Privately, sources say Andrew was deeply unsettled but resolved to fight the allegations tooth and nail. His frustration was compounded by the fact that the scandal not only questioned his role as a father, but also threatened to overshadow his already controversial public image, which had been tarnished by previous accusations unrelated to the current crisis. Andrew's approach was to double down on his public persona, appearing at official events with the confident swagger of a man determined to weather the storm. He gave carefully curated interviews in which he avoided the topic entirely, choosing instead to emphasize his charitable work and military service. However, insiders reported that behind closed doors, his mood was tense, and his patience wore thin as the media frenzy grew. The palace's communication strategy reflected this division. While Camilla's camp advocated for cautious silence and subtle deflection, Andrew's faction pushed for a more aggressive posture, denying outright, threatening legal action, and attempting to discredit the sources of the allegations. This internal disagreement complicated the family's ability to present a unified front, which the press and public quickly noted. Meanwhile, Beatrice found herself caught between the two. Her attempts to seek acknowledgement or even a modicum of empathy from Andrew and Camilla were met with guarded conversations and diplomatic evasions. The familial bonds she had once taken for granted seemed fragile and conditional. The queen consort's silence became a focal point of public speculation. Was it an admission by omission? A strategic choice to avoid giving the scandal further attention? Or was it an indication of the private pain she endured knowing that the truth could unravel years of personal and public reconciliation? Commentators debated fiercely, some sympathetic to her predicament, others critical of what they saw as evasiveness. Andrew's denials, meanwhile, drew mixed reactions. Loyalists praised his steadfastness, seeing in his statements the defense of a father's honor against baseless attacks. Critics accused him of arrogance and obfuscation, arguing that outright denial in the face of DNA evidence only deepened public suspicion. The media's relentless coverage pressured the palace to act, but action had to be measured. An outright acknowledgement could precipitate a constitutional crisis, affecting the line of succession and the monarchy's credibility. A denial risked eroding public trust further. Palace officials found themselves in a perilous balancing act, navigating the treacherous waters of family loyalty, legal ramifications, and public opinion. Amid this, Beatrice's own resolve grew. The silence and denial only deepened her sense of isolation and betrayal. Yet, she also understood the stakes. This was not simply a family matter, but one with implications reaching the highest levels of British society and governance. Her position was precarious. She was the bearer of a truth that others denied, a living challenge to the monarchy's curated image. The gulf between her and those she once called family widened daily, bridged only by the mutual desire to avoid public spectacle. As weeks turned into months, the situation stabilized in a fragile equilibrium. The palace continued to reinforce official narratives, while unofficially bracing for the next inevitable leak, the next tabloid exposé, the next whispered accusation. For Camilla and Andrew, the strategy was endurance, to outlast the media cycle, to weather the storm in hopes that the scandal would eventually fade from memory. For Beatrice, the silence and denial were no longer tolerable. They crystallized her decision to cut ties, a decision that would send shockwaves through the family and mark a turning point in the saga.